objectives. And then you factor what combination of military actions will be sufficient to compel your enemy to do your political will. So in that scheme, tactical objectives derive from operational objectives, operational from strategic objectives, and your strategic objectives derive from your political objectives. And that's where we want to start. That's why I began this course talking about Pearl Harbor, a brilliantly executed military action, but also one that was a colossal strategic blunder. Not only did it not further Japan's achievement of its political objectives, it set that nation on the path to defeat. Well, while thinking through the linkages between military objectives and political objectives, that's certainly where we want to start. That's rarely where we end up. The chief of the Prussian General Staff, architect of Prussia's stunning victories over Austria and France in the 1860s and 1870s, well, he once said, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy." Unless your adversary is a potted plant, war never tracks along some linear script like the one I just laid out. And that's why I want to spend some time today talking about the other definition of strategy that I covered in that first lecture. That definition looks at strategy as the process of adapting, of seizing opportunities in the midst of a war, to link unanticipated military opportunities to desired political outcomes. And to explore that definition, let's take another page from American military history and see how George Washington adapted and rescued the cause of American independence from the jaws of defeat. After the colonists had driven the British out of Boston, Washington set his mind to the next phase of the campaign, the defense of New York City. Based on the lessons of Bunker Hill, Washington assumed that the Continentals would hold their ground against the Redcoats and inflict unacceptable costs on the British. And this is how strategy is supposed to work, right? You start with your political objective, in this case independence, and then figure out ways to inflict enough pain on your enemy to force him to accept your terms. So Washington was predicting how the American Revolution might play out. If Washington could offer a staunch enough defense of New York, the war might culminate there and the British might offer terms. He based this on personal experiences and on his reading of history. Washington was doing what we want a strategist to do. But Washington was also guilty of what we call script writing, assuming that an adversary will act in predictable ways. So if I do A, he will do B, and then C and D will follow from there. These can be really dangerous assumptions. At this point, we might want to imagine what some of our masters might have offered as advice to Washington in the spring of 1776 in the lead up to the Battle of New York. Some of them might have asked him if he really knew himself and knew the enemy, and did he really know the terrain that he was going to be fighting? Machiavelli would have admired Washington's citizen army and warned him about going toe-to-toe with British and Hessian professionals. Clausewitz would probably have agreed that the British army was the strategic center of gravity, but would also question whether or not Washington was going to have enough mass at the decisive point. And Mahan and Corbett would have warned Washington that Britain had complete command of the sea and the critical strategic mobility that comes with that level of command. As it turned out, the British were anything but a cooperative adversary in New York. In that summer, 1776, the British massed a huge expeditionary force to face off against Washington's army. That force included 70 warships, 10,000 sailors, 23,000 redcoats, and another 10,000 Hessian mercenaries. What followed was the largest battle of the American Revolution, the Battle of Long Island in August of 1776. Despite what he thought he had learned in Boston, Washington's 10,000 Continentals and 9,000 militiamen were no match for the British and the Hessians. They were outmaneuvered and outfought at every turn. Only by a stroke of good fortune was Washington able to evacuate his army from Brooklyn and wage a fighting retreat along Manhattan Island. The Americans then lost 2 more battles in quick succession at White Plains and Fort Washington. Between the hundreds killed, the thousands captured, and the countless desertions, Washington's army had dwindled to about 3,000 men by December of 1776. Washington's script for some kind of Jominian or Clausewitzian decisive battle turned out to be a colossal failure. It also turned out to be the turning point of the war because Washington had the ability to reassess his strategic options and adapt his strategy, the one that sought a decisive result in the short term, to something more akin to math, to wage what's called a Fabian strategy, to play for time, to wear down the means and the will of the enemy, try to get some outside assistance, in this case from France, before going back on the strategic offense when the time was right. So at Pearl Harbor, we had a spectacular tactical and operational success that led to strategic disaster. At New York, an operational and tactical disaster forced a successful strategic adaptation. If you want a wonderfully written, eminently strategic treatment of Washington's reassessment after the New York debacle, you can't go wrong with a book called Washington's Crossing by James Hackett Fisher. It's a fascinating exploration, of the dynamic interaction and adaptation game that took place between the summer of 1777 and Washington's attacks on Krystle in the winter of 76-77. When you read that book, you can't help but conjure up echoes of Sunza, Machiavelli, Clausewitz, and Mao. In the end, Washington's strategic adaptation paid off. A well-executed Fabian strategy along with a lot of luck, some great operational and strategic leaders, and an awful lot of French help, culminated in the Battle of Yorktown in 1781, where Washington finally got his decisive blow, a blow that shattered Britain's political will. Back in 1776, it took vision and moral courage to change his course so radically. It also took a favorable environment and the steadfastness on the part of the Continental Congress. It's hard to imagine in this day and age a military commander coming out of a disaster like New York and still having a job. But what if Washington had been relieved of command? What was the alternative? Well, one alternative was a partisan guerrilla war advocated by General Charles Lee. Lee had something akin to that Kissinger thesis I talked about in our discussion of Mao. You know, the guerrilla wins by not losing and gradually by frustrating the enemy to the point that he gives up. But Washington wasn't willing to do that. Washington needed to keep the Continental Army intact as a body in order to ultimately transition to the counteroffensive. He knew that was the only way to hurt the British enough to make them concede. Had Lee won the argument, we might very well imagine the entire movement for American independence simply dying on the vine. But that didn't happen, and it had a lot to do with Washington's stature, but it also had a lot to do with the fact that Washington and his subordinates thought strategically and were able to make cogent and sound arguments in favor of their strategic preferences. Fortunately, Washington wasn't just an adaptable strategist, blessed with Machiavelli's virtù. He was also blessed with having Alexander Hamilton on his staff. Even after Washington's victories at Trenton and Princeton, there was a lot of unease about the Fabian strategy. In June of 1777, Hamilton, Washington's aide, wrote to Robert Livingston, a powerful member of the Continental Congress. The purpose of the letter was to justify the Fabian strategy and to sell it to skeptics. Hamilton, only 20 years old at the time, right? This letter is a masterpiece of strategic analysis. Hamilton assessed the strengths and weaknesses of both sides and showed how the Fabian strategy played to American strengths and attacked British weaknesses. In other words, he understood the contest between Britain and the colonies. Hamilton also assessed the larger international context within which the war was being fought. Hamilton is exactly the kind of officer that I want to have come through my seminar. Strategically minded, politically savvy, and eloquent. And this is really the key to successful strategy in general and to successful strategic adaptation in particular. Individuals like Washington and Hamilton. To borrow a metaphor from the British strategic theorist Colin Gray, strategy is the bridge between politics and war. It spans the gulf between policy and military operations. The best strategy our comparative lecture on Clausewitz and Jomini, I mentioned a book by Elliot Cohen called Supreme Command, Soldier, Statesman, and Leadership in Wartime. In contrast to the normal theory that posits that a sharp line be drawn between soldiers and statesmen, Cohen's unequal dialogue has the statesman engaging in the judicious supervision of the war, maintaining the subordination of strategy to policy by questioning and even second-guessing the military judgments of the soldiers.